So I'm going to be talking about identifying the morally exceptional. And our empirical project had three broad goals in mind. One of them was, of course, the assessment and identification of those people who are morally exceptional. And then we wanted to and still want to move on to look at what do they do in their daily lives, how do they conduct themselves, how do other people perceive them, and then also look at the consequences. So what does it mean to be morally exceptional for you and for other people? And to look at our second and third goal, we of course first have to have a valid and reliable assessment and identification. So I'm going to focus on that because that was for us the hardest challenge, and we are still actually in the process of gathering data, and we're going to talk about some pilot studies we've done and some analysis we've already run on those, and what we uncovered in identifying the morally exceptional. So our thought was there is a certain latent continuum of being moral, and on one side you have those who are morally bright. Those are going to be the ones we are probably most interested in, the moral beacons. Then we have people who are rather morally gray. These are probably going to be the most people in the middle. And then we have, on the other hand, people who are also morally exceptional, but in a kind of bad sense. They are the morally dark, the exceptional, immoral people. What we wanted to look at is these three groups and see how do they conduct themselves in their daily lives, and especially how are the morally bright different from the other ones? And then what are the consequences of being morally bright versus being morally gray and morally dark? To do this, we had, or we still have actually, because it's still running, a semi-longitudinal design. At time one, we are assessing people's morality broadly with self-reports, with peer reports, and also with some behavior, so people can spend their money on different charities, and we're protocolling how much they're willing to spend on that. And this phase one is the most important one, phase one being the leftmost one, because in that phase we are trying to identify those three extreme groups, or I should say those two extreme groups, morally bright and morally dark, and the middle group. And once we've identified those, we are going to go on only with those people. So in terms of this distribution of scores here, we are not working with these people or these people, but we're working with those in the middle and the extreme groups. So it is extremely important that we have a good assessment at phase one, because all the other phases are going to depend on that assessment. Our phase two is an ambulatory assessment study, experience sampling study, where people report on their daily behaviors, daily emotions, daily cognitions. And then we have a post-test where we are again sampling people's self-reports, peer reports, and we've called it experimental games here, but basically it's again going to be about charity. So the big question we had is, how do we get from our broad sample and all of these distributions of scores to these three groups of people, the morally bright, the morally gray, and the morally dark? And the problem is here, we have to somehow find a criterion to define group membership. So who comes into which of these groups, or who would not come into any of these groups and thus not go on in our study. And one of the defining criteria or content criteria we used was the Moral Foundations Questionnaire, the MFQ. And first of all, to work with this MFQ, our goal was to examine its factor structure and the distributions of scores we would have in a German sample, especially as in comparison to US findings you have already found. So we had several things in mind here, which some of them included replicating previous work to know that our MFQ works similarly than it has in others' work. So there was a recent publication about the MFQ that looked at the replicability or generalizability of the factor structure across different people. And what they found is that the measurement of the MFQ wasn't as invariant as one would hope. And what we mean by measurement invariance is that sometimes you would want to compare people or groups on mean scores of morality relevant dimensions. And if you want to do that, you have to make sure that in both groups you are actually measuring the same thing. That's measurement invariance. There are different forms of measurement invariance, and we'll soon see that certain forms of measurement invariance are given and a certain form is not. But what came out here is that both groups had the same structure and loadings of the MFQ items onto their latent scales, but different intercepts. This also means that it is actually not permissible to compare MFQ scores between these groups, at least the ones they had here. And you could still look at correlations. The structure is still okay, but looking at means is going to be a problem here. And we ask ourselves, is this also going to be a problem in our data? So can we compare means? Can we even compare the means maybe across different countries? And the main problem behind all of this thinking is that if we are to define these three groups, the morally dark, bright, and gray, and we cannot really compare them on anything, then we're having a true problem. So we did a pilot study with German data, and you'll soon see we also got from other people, we got their data and also had, well, let's say a mega study where we look at different things. But first of all, we did this pilot study here, and our goal was to look at the measurement invariance of the MFQ scales. And then we also added in some other variables, such as people's political leanings, being more conservative versus liberal. And we wanted to replicate a specific paper here. Liberals and conservatives rely on different sets of moral foundations. You'll soon see if we actually did replicate that in Germany. This procedure was done online only in Form R. Form R uses the statistical package R, and you basically write down everything in Excel sheets. That gets transferred into R, and then it is transferred into a shiny online version. And the nice thing is that while the data are coming in, you can already have the data analyzed. So each analysis is being updated as the data come in. Of course, you still should not do data peaking and sequential sampling when you're using p-values. If you're using Bayesian statistics, you can still do so. But that's something else. I'm digressing here. So the participants received individual feedback and on their personal morality scores. This was pre-registered. You can see here the link if you want to check out the pre-registration. I guess these slides are going to be shared with everyone, so you can then click on this pre-registration. We had 318 people, about 62% were female, and people were on average about 29 years old. The measures we had, of course, was the MFQ. We were especially interested in the MFQ, but we also had some other measures because we wanted to replicate certain things and see if we can work with this measure feasibly in Germany. So we had the moral foundation sacredness scale, we had a flourishing scale, we had 4 items assessing people's political orientation, which was here in a continuum from more liberal to more conservative, and we had socio-demographic variables such as sex or gender identity and age. We got additional data from other authors to examine measurement invariance, and this additional data came from Davis and colleagues, which were 490 people, and they had black people and white people, or people who described themselves as black and white. Then data from Jöckel and colleagues, 301. There were almost 50% Germans and 50% US Americans in that sample. And then a sample from Baumann and colleagues, 453 people from Germany and again from the US, because we're going to be interested in looking at measurement invariance also across countries. So our total sample then was almost 1,500 people with whom we could work, and it was almost 50 US American and 50 German. So one thing we looked at in the German sample is quite basically, do we get acceptable fits for measurement models that would look at, do these 4 MFQ items actually load sufficiently on their latent factor they're supposed to? And although you can see some frownies here, on average, all of these numbers, it's good, it's okay, it's not bad. I just made these here to show you that one of them was particularly good, which was purity. Then we have some that are kind of meh, that's harm and fairness, and then we have those that didn't perform as well as the other ones, but still okay. And those were in-group and authority. So what we gleaned from this here is that the measurement models didn't fit terribly well, but they also weren't bad measurement models. But one thing we also looked at is, because these here are looking at the 5 dimensions separately, so we ran 5 separate models. But of course, you can also run all of this in one model and with the higher order factors, which we also did. And that model, this is the one down here, it didn't fit well. We don't have to go into details what those numbers mean, but I'm just telling you that didn't fit well, at least not in our German sample. So that is going to have some implications later on, because we're going to be talking about averaging across these 5 dimensions. And if this model doesn't fit well, the question is if an average across these 5 dimensions is going to be a good thing. But at least when you take them individually, we have a decent fit in our German data. Then we looked at measurement invariance across groups being here the US and Germany. You can again see a lot of numbers here, and here even more numbers. And I'm going to tell you what these numbers mean. Those numbers mean that we do have similarities in loadings, and we can look at correlations. So if we have correlations in Germany and we have correlations in the US, we are allowed to interpret them and look at those differences, but we are not allowed to look at mean differences. That we cannot establish. So measurement invariance in terms of means or intercepts is not given. Still, I want to show you the means, but try to resist the urge of comparing them too strongly. So this here is the plot from the Germans and the US Americans on the 5 MFQ dimensions. And if we were allowed to actually make valid statements about means, we would conclude that the US Americans on average show higher responses on these 3 here, in-group authority and purity, and there's not such a strong difference in harm and fairness. Now, if we look at the red ones, the German ones, and because we're working with German data, we were a little bit more concerned about the German data, we notice here at hardness and fairness that the variance, and the variance is going to be this here, is kind of restricted. So there's not a lot going on in terms of people giving different responses. And if we look at the distribution of scores, this is another fancy picture here, you can see that the first 2, harm and fairness, do not show a spread as strong as the scores on purity, authority, and in-group in the German sample. And this restricted variance is going to be a problem, because we want to look at on a distribution, on a latent distribution of overall morality, these extreme groups. But if we have restrictions here, we barely have people who are low on harmness and fairness, how are we going to get a reliable assessment of those people who are morally dark? So that is already foreshadowing maybe a potential problem. But we can see here, these 3 have a nice spread. So that is a good thing. So some conclusions from this small pilot study we did. If we were to interpret means, then the US are high on 3 foundations, in-group authority and purity. That is at least when we just compare those raw means with each other. But in terms of measurement invariance, we may not be able or permitted to actually compare those means with each other. In Germany, we have unfortunately restricted variance in harm and fairness. Most people tend to use the upper boundaries of those 2, and there's not a lot of spread in the data. And our overall picture is what we glean from this here. It may be difficult to average these 5 dimensions in Germany into one latent morality dimension and then extract the extreme scores. But that is, of course, what we wanted to do, what we also pre-registered to do, and most of all, what is feasible to do when we are doing the assessment. You'll soon see that I will talk about our online assessment and how that works, because we're actually on the go classifying people into certain groups. And that classification is only going to work if we have to work with 1 score, but not with those 5. That is going to make it a little bit too difficult. So to summarize, up until now, the measurement model showed an acceptable fit. All of these fits were still acceptable. You did see some frownies, but that was only to show you which ones of them were fitting less well to the data as opposed to the other ones. And we do have mean differences between the US and Germany. We're not allowed to interpret them, but we'll soon see later, because we try to replicate something. Do we find similar findings? Do we find similar substantive findings, similar correlations between the MFQ and other things than what has been reported in literature? Because then we know our MFQ is working how it is supposed to work. And those findings also are going to be hopefully robust, because we could find them again. Our German participants did not endorse binding foundations as much as the US participants did. And we found only metric measurement invariance, which means that we cannot compare means, as I said. So what we also did with our data up until now is we tried to replicate a finding about liberals and conservatives. As I said, we also sampled some other variables. And the main finding by Graham and colleagues was that liberals endorse mainly moral foundations of harm and fairness, whereas the conservatives kind of endorse all of these foundations equally. So there's no preference for different foundations as opposed to the liberals. This is a study that a master student of ours did, Claire, and this study is right now being written up. It's actually written up as a master's thesis already, just has to be shortened a little bit, and we'll submit it soon. It was pre-registered, and the data are openly accessible as are the materials. And again, I've shown you the link, but I'm happy to share that again with you. So here is one of the findings that we sought to replicate. And as you can see here, we have a continuum from very liberal to very conservative. And then we have how relevant to moral judgment. 1, never and always. 1 is never. 6 is always. And then we have the 5 MFQ dimensions: harm, fairness, in-group authority, purity. And the interesting thing is this junction here, because the more liberal people endorse harm and fairness more. And when you look at the conservative, they actually endorse all of them. So that is an interesting finding that we sought to replicate to see if our MFQ dimensions would behave similarly. And yes, they did. So this here looks almost the same as the US data. This is our German data. And as you can see, we found the same findings: harm and fairness are highly endorsed by those people who describe themselves as very liberal, and those people who describe themselves as very conservative endorse all of these. One thing that's a little bit different from the US data is that our German people had higher scores on authority, much higher than the US ones. But still, I think the general pattern, the substantive finding, has been replicated. So this is a nice thing. Here is a structural equation model. I don't want to go into too much detail what's happening here. I'm going to say what all of this is. So what they did is they predicted the 5 MFQ dimensions from political identity and controlled for, as you can see, age, gender, household income, and education. What they found is political identity negatively predicted harm and fairness, and positively the other ones. So what we're looking at here are structural elements that we sought to replicate, and we replicated it. It's the same. We have ours is a little bit. Our estimates are a little bit higher, but still, it's basically the same. So our MFQ scales in Germany function similarly than these US scales. So we are happy, of course, that this worked, because this means that we can use them for further work, that they are probably valid. So we're not so much concerned about validity, because we think they are doing what they're supposed to do and measure what they're supposed to measure. We are a little bit more concerned about reliability issues, and that's something I hope we can discuss afterwards. Talking about validity, we also looked at the intercorrelations among these, and as you can see, harm and fairness are highly correlated, and then we have in-group authority and purity being highly correlated, and this also seems to replicate previous work. So this was nice for us. But of course, this is just a prelude to the things we are trying to do, which is identify those 2 extreme groups and those people in the middle. And now in the German sample, this is the actual distribution that you get when you average across all MFQ dimensions. And here are those people, the green ones. Those would be the morally bright, those with the extreme scores on being, or on reporting, on having high MFQ dimensions across the board. And then you have the low scores, the red ones. Those are the morally dark. And then in the middle, that sliver there, that is the morally gray, right in the middle. So our first question is this here this distribution, this average, a valid indicator of people's morality? We've seen previously that the individual dimensions are, but we're not quite sure if this average is going to be a valid one. And then the question is, our two extreme groups, did we weirdly operationalize them because we're using this average? And of course, that is a validity problem, but the other one is a reliability problem because the measurement back here is not going to be as reliable as the measurement over here. So that is also something we need to take into account when doing this. So we knew we couldn't just take this sample, define the cutoff as being 4.78, and this cutoff as being 3.08 or something, and then using that cutoff again and again in our large sample to get at our groups. We had to do something else. So one thing that we came up with is maybe using this as a starting point, but then having in our real large sample these cutoffs being updated continually. So we started with those points, but right now we're sampling people, and those people are creating new sets of scores, and this distribution is being updated by each new person that comes in, so the cutoffs are also being updated. And as we approach more and more people, we're aiming for a little bit over 1,000, maybe even 1,200, we will get a more reliable assessment of the people back here. A drawback, of course, is that the people who have been sampled more in the front of our sampling strategy are not going to be as reliably put into their different groups as the people later on, because later on we're working with a much more reliable distribution. So this was one part that we had to figure out. How do we do an ongoing and immediate assessment of people's morality based on that one score? And we opted still to use one score averaged across all MFQ dimensions because it was just computationally too difficult to take all 5 scores into account, and it wasn't clear how you would get a program to work that, to kind of triangulate all of these scores and put people into those extreme groups. And as I said, we used the average. That was one decision. The other decision was to first use the cutoff criteria we found previously, which I've shown you, and then have those cutoff criteria being updated again and again. And this data is being gathered right now, and we hope to soon know how reliable the assessment is at different time points of sampling. And as I said, my hypothesis would be that the reliability is going to be strong at the end as opposed to the beginning. Then some general problems we ran into with these extreme groups is that we noticed the definition, at least in our data, is more or less arbitrary. We could have focused on one MFQ dimension, or as we did, we focused on an amalgamation, an average across all. Then these cutoffs, at least at the beginning, when you do not have large samples, are probably not as reliable as you want them to be. So that is a problem. And also these cutoffs are always made in comparison to other people. So we're not using an absolute cutoff criterion, but a relative cutoff criterion, because you're looking at these distributions of scores. And we can also question what an extreme score actually means psychologically. So if you have an extreme score, if you are in that group, why are you in that group? Have you been managing impressions? Have you maybe even been lying? Have you had social desirable responding? Was there acquiescence? We still do not know what the psychological processes are at the moment when people are answering those items. But to give you a small glimpse of one person who actually wrote us a comment, because people could write comments about our study, here's one person who gave insights into his or her psychological processes, and I think this is an important example, because it might have been one of the people we wanted in our study, but that we could not retain. So that's another problem that I'd be happy to discuss. I'll show you this person. This person left us this note. It was in German, so we translated it. I participated in this study. I think some of the questions asked are abnormal, and I did not want to or could not answer them. This concerns patriotism, pride, unnatural deeds, whatever that is, the price for having 2 weeks headache, or insulting family members. Each question without a context. Have you taken the survey? I think the questionnaire is repellent and disgusting. I am sorry, but I cannot forward this survey and support this work. So this person's talking also about the MFQ, right? The interesting thing here is that this person does have a certain moral sense or has the feeling that this questionnaire and the setup has breached it. So this might have been a person we wanted to have in our sample, but we of course missed out on this person because he or she did not want to forward the survey and also didn't fill it out. We just got the comments. And the problem is that we do not know how many other people feel like this. And of course, we also do not know if this person was exceptionally moral. We do not know that. Maybe not, but maybe that person is. But if persons who are exceptionally moral feel like this and do not take part in our study, then we have another problem, which is we're not actually sampling the people we want to sample. We're not getting those beacons because they think these studies are not worth anything and are actually disgusting or abnormal. So this is something that gave us pause where we thought about what could we do about this. There's actually not a lot we could do about this, but there's something an opportunity to think about what are the people who are participating, and even if we get those extreme groups, and we can get those extreme groups, we're getting those extreme groups, do they really capture those people we want? Do they really capture those moral beacons? And that is maybe something I'd like to open up for discussion, which is good because time is up. Thank you.
Yeah, this is maybe I missed it, but when you average those 5 scales together, is that going to get your conservative? Like if they're kind of bunching up and having the same score, they'd be kind of on average high on everything, whereas like liberals would actually probably have a lower overall score.
Yes, that's a problem. What happens with that overall score? Yeah, the good thing is that in Germany, conservatism isn't that is a little bit different than conservatism here. So we're probably all socialists in Germany, but and there are also not as many. So that's also important to note. Let me see if I should get back. Here you can see one thing. These are CIs. You see the CIs, they're really large because we don't have a lot of people back here, so it doesn't happen that often. But still, of course, if we had the same amount of very left-wing and same amount of very conservative, then we would have that problem. Yes?
So I'm just wrestling with, and I think it was 2 years ago too, the idea of sort of collapsing across all 5 dimensions, right? And because so many moral issues are conflicts between, say, loyalty and fairness, right? Or between, where these things are in conflict with one another. And so what's your sense of, what's your response? I mean, what's the justification for putting all these 5 things which are different, which divide people and all this into one bucket as opposed to something else, right? That isn't just sort of the stew of moral considerations.
So it is conceptually better to do what you said. It's just practically quite difficult to do that. So we had to make a call of what is.
If data issues weren't if we lived in a perfect world,
yes.
What would you do? What would be your ideal way of doing it?
I would probably sample. So let me go back to this distribution. So one thing I would do is explore more. I know we pre-registered everything, but one thing I would do is sample all of these people on everything, and especially on all of these steps. So first of all, no group separation, sample all of them, then explore and maybe look at potential conflicts within people in different MFQ dimensions, and just explore what is going on in the data, what are they telling me, find consistent patterns, and then go on to have a second highly powered study where I would define those groups if I can find any groups. The problem is with these groups, they have to be defined on some criterion data. And I always have to use one variable or maybe a different score or something. And here we used an average to get these extreme groups before we did anything else. And maybe if we had more time, of course, and if we had more money and exploration, in an entire sample would have been what I would have gone for. Yes?
Yeah, so I sort of shared that one question about why combine them, because it's not clear to me what because that's the moral foundations question here doesn't actually measure how moral you are, right? It measures what you value. So it's sort of like having the most values or something.
And the self-reported value at that.
Yeah.
What do you
But
think?
my other question is about why only that. So it's sort of like the opposite question. The first question is why all of that, and then the second question is, well, why only that? Because you have a self-rating battery listed up there. So are there other questionnaires that you did in this first phase?
We also have other questionnaires, of course, and we have, or we will have soon, all of these peer ratings because they're trickling in. But the problem is with, because we also wanted to create scores from the peer ratings, it just takes too long until they come in. So we couldn't feasibly in time get these groups to then do the other things. So that's why we're not using the peer ratings. And we're using for self-reports only that one because we've confirmed that that worked. We've also looked at some other things which unfortunately didn't replicate as well as they should have or weren't as reliable as we wanted them to be, so we just discarded them in creating the groups.
It might still be measurement properties on the other self-report questionnaires were not good enough for your...
At least not for what we wanted to do here
them.
to get these groups, because this, and we said we wanted to be a little bit more conservative here and try to keep the measurement error as low as possible. And we noticed that we had, well, I would say acceptable fit indices for the MFQ dimensions. Things worked out as they should have worked, so we knew they were picking up on what they should have. And that's why we went with the safe option, because we wanted this group selection to be as safe as possible, because if it isn't, then we're not quite sure what's happening over here then in the other phases.
So just to follow up on Will's point, so what were some of the other measures you included that could have been candidates for splitting people out, apart from moral foundations?
We had these here.
So
And
those are all the
but no, those are not all of them. We had more. We also had some very specific German ones. You can go to the link and look at all of these. But the problem then again was, if we wanted to get that average, across what would we average? We couldn't average across all of them. No model would fit that would support that we can just make one latent score out of it. So we didn't use the other measures. Yes?
I don't know if I'm getting this straight, but I think on one of the first slides you mentioned that you would also want to follow up with the experience sampling study. Is that right?
Yes, so once we have those groups, once people have been sorted into a group, and in each group we want about 200 people, those would go on to do an experience sampling study, also done in FormR, and then later they will do a post-test again.
I guess my question was just out of curiosity, what were you going to look at in that experience sampling? What kind of variables would you look at?
So we are having state MFQs or state thoughts about these. We have state temptations, we have state situation characteristics, and we have personality states. So it's quite a lot for each measurement point, and unfortunately that means that each dimension is only measured on one item. So that again is a problem with reliability, but we made sure that we had items that were at least valid for what they're supposed to measure. Yes, Mike?
I mean, it seems like you put a lot of work into really ensuring, like, you know, the internal validity of the measure, and that's great. But I don't know. I still share the concern that Erica raised, that like you have other validity concerns with that approach by potentially having a bias, you know, along some of these other demographic dimensions. So I wonder if you might approach that eventually in some other way.
With a new sample at some point, yeah. We would have to do that. And at some point what I would like to do is actually sample the entire distribution and then explore a little bit more. Because now we pre-registered all of these things, and that is how we are going to do it. There were some slight changes we had to do, but basically we knew what we wanted to do and set out to do, and we tried to do that as well as we could. But I would try to do things differently if I could get another sample.
Have you already taken these subsamples and put them through the experience sampling?
Maybe. I wouldn't say subsamples yet because we're maybe it's only some people who are in that phase and they're doing that right now, but we haven't. I wouldn't say we have a full subsample of the morally dark or morally bright yet. So I cannot look at those samples yet. I could maybe go into the data and identify single people that are doing this right now. At the beginning, I saw people over here raising their hands. Yes?
So a bit curious about the ambulatory assessment phase. Did I understand this right, that the main aim is more to see if the dispositions you assess at the first term are more or less reflected in the state measures, or are there any measures like behavior assessments, or self-reports about concrete situations that people are confronted with and have to, for example, decide, or so you can predict something from the first medication?
Mm-hmm. So we don't have the concrete situation, so people don't have the time to write down, I'm in this and that situation, but we are asking about the psychological characteristics of situations. So for example, if they include some levels of adversity or deception. And of course, we do have from time one the dispositional variables. And one thing we're interested in is person-situation interactions or person-situation transactions that we could find. So how do dispositions and these situation characteristics shape the momentary behavior of these people? And then another question is, are there going to be differences between these three groups? So if we do find an association in the morally bright between one MFQ and maybe a state MFQ and some situation moderator, are we going to find the same relationships also in the other three samples? And we,
What means the interaction and behavior in your case? So is it about how often people attend to situations that have certain characteristics, or how they are perceived, or how they behave?
it's how they perceive their situations. Yeah. So they randomly get their experience sampling link, and then they will be asked, how do you perceive this situation? They wouldn't report on specific situations, though. So it's really random situations varying between people, and people report on their perceived situation characteristics, which may or not be in line with how the situation actually is. And of course, the behaviors they report are self-reported behaviors, so it's not actual behavior we can sample. Some people think differently about that, but I think it's still basically self-reports that we're having there. Yes?
So several people have raised the question about what this amalgamation of the really means as a score, which makes me curious. I noticed in the very first slide you said that that the subjects received feedback as to what their scores meant.
That's in the pilot study. That's in the pilot study. They're not, so in the, yes, because we had a pilot study where we had,
Well, regardless, I'm just curious, what feedback did you give them?
well, they got
What
their,
did you tell them their scores meant?
well,
Right there. They received individual feedback, their personality score. What did you tell them then?
well, they got, let me show you. They would get something that would show them their score and the average of people's other scores. And they would get a description of what that dimension meant generally and what high and low scores meant. But we didn't really tell them if they are normatively above or below. They would just kind of see if they're more in line with the average that you would get in Germany versus another one.
So for them, you did break it out.
Yes, they did get something, but it's not like we told them, well, you are morally dark and, or congratulations, you're morally bright. But they did kind of see it, and they had a verbal description of what those things meant, especially concerning what a high and a low end would mean. So if they saw, oh, I'm up here, then they would say, oh, okay, this means this and that. So that's what it was. But it wasn't as complex as looking at Z-scores and normative scores and stuff like that.
Any other questions?
I'm interested in how I think you said the MFQ is also assessed in the ambulatory assessment at the state level. What exactly is being assessed about sort of these 5 dimensions at the state level?
they, well, what we ask them is in that specific moment, how much they would now value that in that specific moment, because we also have those situations. And one thing we were interested in is if a specific characteristics would activate people to value something momentarily in those. Yeah. And if we also have
how much they value that dimension.
in that specific, so for now, how much is that here? So that would be more a kind of a value dimension. The situation characteristics is more a perceptual dimension of the situations. And then quasi-behavioral, the kind of big 5, big 6, it's not really behavior, but enacting something or thinking about how much you're enacting that. And we would like to go into those small-scale dynamics, what's going on with those, and also predict those from dispositional variables we had previously. And then maybe even have those things predict the later post-assessment peer reports, the reputations that people have of those people.
I think that's all we have time for right now.
Thank you.
We'll be back.